The sky was a deep gray, heavy with the promise of rain. In a quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, the streets buzzed with life as the weekend markets sprawled through the main square. Amidst the chatter of vendors and the aroma of freshly baked bread, there was an unusual hush whenever a particular girl passed by. Her silver hair gleamed like moonlight, catching the attention of every passerby. She moved swiftly, her head down, avoiding their stares. It had been this way for as long as she could remember. She was born with hair the color of frost, a shimmering silver so bright it seemed to glow under sunlight. Her parents had been startled at her birth, not knowing what to make of it. The midwife had whispered words like blessing and curse, crossing herself in fear. The doctors couldn't explain it either, though they tried to assure her parents it was just a rare genetic anomaly. But the townsfolk, steeped in old beliefs and superstitions, had their own theories. By the time she turned 5, stories about her had already spread. Some said she was touched by the divine, while others whispered she was cursed by forces best left unnamed. Children in the neighborhood avoided her, their parents warning them to keep their distance. Even as she grew older, no one dared come close, and she learned to live with the solitude that wrapped around her like an invisible cloak. But the silver hair wasn't just unusual, it came with something else, something she didn't fully understand. From an early age, she could feel things most others couldn't. She sensed when someone was lying, could tell if someone was in pain even if they were smiling. She felt an odd connection to the world around her, as though the air, the trees, and even the ground beneath her feet were alive and whispering secrets only she could hear. Her parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination, but she knew better. There was something different about her, and the silver hair was only the surface of it. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood by her bedroom window, staring out at the fields stretching toward the forest. She'd always been drawn to the woods, even though she'd been warned never to go near them. They said strange things happened there, lights that flickered without a source, voices carried on the wind with no one around to speak them. Yet tonight, as the first stars appeared in the sky, she felt an overwhelming urge to step outside. It wasn't curiosity but something deeper, like an invisible thread pulling her toward the trees. Her parents were downstairs, distracted by the evening news, so she slipped out unnoticed. The cool air kissed her skin as she walked toward the edge of the forest, her silver hair catching the faint glow of moonlight. The closer she got, the stronger the pull became, until it felt like her feet were moving of their own accord. Her heart pounded, but she wasn't scared. Instead, she felt an odd sense of belonging, as though the forest had been waiting for her. The moment she stepped between the trees, the world seemed to change. The air was thicker, almost humming with energy. She paused, unsure of what to do next, when a sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves overhead. It wasn't just the wind, though. She could swear she heard whispers, soft and melodic, like a song sung in a language she didn't understand. She followed the sound deeper into the forest, her footsteps light against the mossy ground. The whispers grew louder, leading her to a clearing where the trees opened up to reveal the night sky. In the center of the clearing was a strange formation of stones, arranged in a perfect circle. They looked ancient, weathered by time, and yet they pulsed faintly with a light that seemed to come from within. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as the whispers crescendoed into a single, haunting note. Then the note stopped. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. She stood frozen, her silver hair shimmering in the faint glow of the stones. And then, as though the universe itself had taken a breath, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. A soft, golden light erupted from the center of the circle, spiraling upward like a flame. She stumbled back, shielding her eyes, but the light wasn't blinding. It was warm, almost welcoming, and it seemed to wrap around her like a gentle embrace. Before she could make sense of what was happening, the light condensed into a single point, floating just above the ground. Slowly it began to take shape, a figure, human-like but not entirely so. Its features were indistinct, as though carved from light itself, and its eyes glowed with an intensity that made her feel as though it could see straight into her soul. "You've come," it said, its voice resonating in her mind rather than her ears. "We have waited for you." Her mouth went dry, and she struggled to find words. "Who are you?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, studying her. "That is not the question you should be asking," it said. "The question is, who are you?" She frowned, confusion mingling with the strange sense of calm that had settled over her. "I'm just me," she said. "I don't understand what's happening." The figure stepped closer, the light around it flickering like flames. "You were born with a purpose," it said. "A purpose written in the strands of your hair and the essence of your being. You carry within you a power older than this world, a power that has been dormant for too long." She shook her head, taking a step back. "I don't have any power," she said. "I'm just a girl." The figure's gaze softened, and for a moment, it seemed almost human. "You feel it, don't you?" it said. "The connection to the world around you, the whispers of the wind, the truth in people's hearts. That is only the beginning." She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, the figure raised a hand, and the world around her shifted. The forest, the stones, even the night sky dissolved into darkness, and she found herself standing in a vast, endless void. Stars blinked into existence around her, forming constellations she didn't recognize. And then, in the distance, she saw it, a massive, swirling vortex of light and color, like a gateway to another world. "This is what lies beyond," the figure said, its voice echoing in the void. "And this is what you are meant to protect." She turned to face it, her heart racing. "Protect from what?" she asked. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it reached out, and for the first time, she felt its touch, a warmth that spread through her like a flame. Images flooded her mind, worlds crumbling, stars burning out, and a shadow that consumed everything in its path. "From them," the figure said, its voice tinged with a sorrow that sent chills down her spine. "They are coming, and only you can stand in their way." Her knees felt weak, and she sank to the ground, her silver hair spilling around her like liquid light. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Why me?" The figure knelt beside her, its glowing eyes meeting hers. "Because you were chosen," it said simply. "And because time is running out." Before she could respond, the void began to collapse, the stars winking out one by one. The figure's light dimmed, and its form began to dissolve. "You must find the others," it said, its voice fading. "They will guide you. But be careful, the shadow knows who you are, and it will stop at nothing to destroy you." And then, just like that, she was back in the forest, the clearing empty and silent. The stones no longer glowed, and the whispers were gone. She sat there, her mind racing, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Somewhere, deep in the forest, a low, guttural growl broke the silence. Her blood ran cold, and she realized with chilling certainty that whatever the figure had warned her about, it was already here. The growl came again, low and menacing, vibrating through the air like a warning. She froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. It was coming from the shadows, just beyond the edge of the clearing. The forest, which had felt alive and welcoming only moments ago, now seemed suffocating, the trees pressing in like silent witnesses to her fear. She didn't dare move. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement between the trunks, a shadow shifting unnaturally fast. Then another growl, closer this time, sent a shiver down her spine. Whatever was out there, it wasn't hiding anymore. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't outrun something she couldn't even see. Taking a slow, shaky breath, she forced herself to stand, her knees trembling beneath her. If she stayed in the clearing, she would be trapped. She had to get back to the edge of the forest, back to safety, back to her home. As she took a tentative step toward the path she had come from, A pair of glowing yellow eyes blinked into existence in the shadows. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal she'd ever seen, and they stared at her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. The growling stopped, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. The eyes held her captive, unmoving, and then the thing in the shadows stepped forward. It was massive, its form hulking and distorted, as if it didn't fully belong to this world. Its body shimmered faintly, like smoke trying to take shape, and its claws glinted like jagged shards of obsidian. It tilted its head, studying her the same way the figure of light had, but there was no warmth in this gaze. Her chest tightened, and she felt the urge to scream, but no sound came out. She took a step back, her mind racing for a way to escape. The creature didn't move, its yellow eyes locked on hers. She could feel its presence in a way that went beyond sight, like an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. And then, just as she thought it might lunge, the air around her shifted again. A faint hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the clearing. The creature flinched, its gaze snapping upward toward the trees. For a brief second, its form flickered, becoming even less solid, and then it let out an ear-splitting roar that shook the ground beneath her feet. Before she could process what was happening, it turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint smell of burnt air. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The hum in the air faded, replaced by the distant sounds of the forest slowly coming back to life. Her hands trembled as she clutched the earth beneath her, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what she had just seen, but every instinct in her body told her it was dangerous, and that it wasn't the last she would see of it. Forcing herself to stand, she stumbled back toward the edge of the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. By the time she reached the fields near her home, her legs ached, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The soft glow of the porch light ahead was the only thing that kept her moving. When she stepped through the door, her parents were still in the living room, their voices carrying over the hum of the television. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. Would they even believe her if she told them? "Where have you been?" her father asked, glancing up from his chair. His tone wasn't angry, just curious. "Just outside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother frowned, setting down her knitting. "It's late. You know you shouldn't be wandering around after dark." "I know. Sorry." She tried to sound casual, but the words felt heavy in her throat. They didn't press her further, and she was grateful. She made her way upstairs, her legs still shaky, and closed the door to her room. The moment she was alone, she collapsed onto her bed, staring up at the ceiling. Her mind replayed everything that had happened in the forest, from the glowing stones to the figure of light and the shadowy creature that had followed. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into something far bigger than herself, something she couldn't begin to understand. The figure's words echoed in her mind. "You were chosen. Time is running out." Chosen for what? She didn't feel special. She didn't feel capable of protecting anything, let alone a vast, swirling universe that she barely understood. But the way the figure had looked at her as though she was the key to something vital stuck with her. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were vivid and strange. She saw the figure of light again, standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking a sea of stars. Behind it, the vortex swirled, massive and alive, its colors shifting and blending like a living rainbow. But then the shadow returned, spreading like ink across the sky, consuming everything in its path. She woke with a start, her heart racing and her sheets tangled around her. The first rays of sunlight filtered through her window, and for a brief moment, she felt a sense of relief until she noticed the faint smell of burnt air still lingering in her room. The day passed in a haze. At school, she barely paid attention, her mind preoccupied with what she had seen and the warnings she had been given. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing yellow eyes watching her from the shadows. It wasn't until the afternoon that something happened to break the monotony. As she walked home along the quiet streets, she noticed a figure standing at the corner of her block. At first, she thought it was a stranger, but as she got closer, she realized it was someone she knew, or at least, someone who looked like they belonged. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans. His hair was dark, and his face was calm, almost too calm, like he was waiting for her specifically. "Hello," he said when she stopped a few feet away. His voice was deep but kind, and there was something about the way he spoke that made her uneasy. "Hi," she replied cautiously. "I've been looking for you," he said, his gaze steady. She frowned, taking a step back. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I know you. You have a gift, and there are people who would do anything to take it from you." Her stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" The man's expression grew serious. "The creature you saw last night, it was just the beginning. There are more like it, and they won't stop until they've found what they're looking for. You're not safe, not here, not anywhere." Her mouth went dry, and she struggled to form words. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been watching," he said simply. "It's my job to protect you." She shook her head, her mind reeling. "I don't need protection. I just want to be left alone." "That's not an option anymore," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You've been chosen for a reason, and whether you like it or not, you're part of something much bigger now." She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She turned her head, scanning the street, but there was nothing there, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The man's expression darkened. "They're close," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Her pulse quickened. "Who's close?" "The shadows," he said, stepping closer. "They found you." Before she could ask what he meant, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, and the air grew heavy. She felt the same oppressive presence she had felt in the forest, and her stomach twisted with fear. The man grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "Run," he said, his voice urgent. And this time, she didn't hesitate. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her, the man's footsteps pounding close behind. The street seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the houses blurring together, as fear drove her forward. She didn't dare look back, even as the strange heaviness in the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. "Keep going!" the man shouted, his voice cutting through the rush of blood in her ears. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but she didn't stop. Around her, the world seemed to shift unnaturally. Streetlights flickered, shadows stretched and twisted, and faint whispers curled around her ears, too soft to make out but unmistakably there. She reached the corner at the end of her block, but as she turned, a sharp gust of wind slammed into her, knocking her off balance. She stumbled, barely catching herself before hitting the ground. Behind her, the man skidded to a halt, his hand darting out to steady her. "They're trying to cut us off," he said, his tone grim. "We need to get inside. Now." She didn't argue. Together, they bolted toward a nearby alleyway, its narrow passage partially obscured by overgrown vines and forgotten trash. The darkness closed in around them, and for a brief moment, it felt like the shadows themselves were alive, reaching out to pull them in. "What are they?" she managed to gasp, her voice trembling. "Not something you want to meet head-on," he replied, scanning their surroundings with sharp, darting eyes. "Just keep moving." They emerged on the other side of the alley, finding themselves in an abandoned lot. The open space should have felt safer, but instead, it felt exposed, like they were being watched from all directions. The whispers grew louder now, still unintelligible but undeniably closer. Then she saw them. Shapes moved in the distance, dark and indistinct, but their presence sent a chill through her bones. They didn't walk so much as glide, their forms shifting like smoke in the wind. Yellow eyes blinked open in the darkness, one by one, until it felt like the shadows themselves were staring back at her. "We're out of time," the man said, his voice low but steady. "Stay close to me, no matter what." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The air felt electric, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Her silver hair seemed to catch the faint glow of the streetlights, reflecting it back in a way that made her stand out even more. The first creature emerged fully from the shadows, its massive form towering over them. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, its claws scraping against the ground as it advanced. The others followed, their glowing eyes locked onto her with unsettling precision. The man stepped in front of her, pulling a small object from his pocket. It looked like a simple metallic disc, unremarkable at first glance, but when he pressed his thumb against it, a faint blue light flared to life. The creatures paused, their movements faltering as if they recognized the light and didn't like it. "Stay behind me," he repeated, his voice firm. The creatures circled them slowly, their eyes never leaving her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, just out of sync. She couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the intent behind them, an overwhelming sense of hunger, of need. "They want you," the man said, his grip tightening on the disc. "They can sense your power, and they'll stop at nothing to take it." "I don't have any power," she shot back, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "You do," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "And it's stronger than you realize. That's why they're here." The largest creature let out a low, guttural growl, and the others responded in kind. The man shifted his stance, holding the disc out like a shield. The blue light brightened, casting a shimmering glow across the lot. "Get ready," he said quietly. "For what?" she whispered. But before he could answer, the creatures lunged. The man moved faster than she thought possible, the blue light flaring in response to his movements. The first creature recoiled as the light struck it, its form flickering like a glitch in reality. The others hesitated for only a moment before surging forward, their claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. He fought with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, dodging and countering with movements that didn't belong to an ordinary person. The blue light arced through the air, striking the creatures and forcing them back, but they kept coming, relentless and unyielding. She could only watch, frozen in place, as the battle unfolded. The man was holding his own, but it was clear he was outnumbered. The creatures seemed to learn from each strike, adapting to his movements and closing the gaps in their defenses. And then one of them broke through. Before she could react, the creature was on her, its claws slicing through the air inches from her face. She stumbled back, her arms instinctively rising to protect herself. She expected to feel pain, but instead, there was a flash of light silver, like her hair, and the creature recoiled with a screech, its form dissolving into smoke. She stared at her hands in shock, a faint shimmer of silver light still clinging to her skin. The man glanced back, his eyes widening in surprise. "You're awakening," he said, his voice a mix of awe and urgency. "You need to focus. That light, it's your power." "I don't know how," she cried, her heart pounding. "Trust yourself," he said. "It's already inside you. Let it out." The creatures seemed to sense the shift, their movements growing more frantic as they closed in. She felt the weight of their presence pressing down on her, the whispers clawing at her mind, but she also felt something else, a warmth deep within her, pulsing like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, but she pushed past them, reaching for the light she had felt moments before. It was faint, like a flicker of a candle in the darkness, but as she concentrated, it grew stronger, brighter. When she opened her eyes, the silver light flared around her, illuminating the lot like a beacon. The creatures froze, their forms wavering as if they couldn't withstand the intensity of the light. The man smiled, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Good," he said. "Now hold on to it." But the creatures weren't done. With a collective roar, they surged forward one last time, their desperation driving them into a frenzy. She stood her ground, the light around her pulsing in time with her racing heart. The man moved to her side, the blue light in his hand merging with the silver glow that surrounded her. Together, they faced the oncoming shadows, their combined light pushing back against the darkness. But the battle wasn't over yet. The largest creature let out an ear-piercing screech, its form shifting and growing until it towered over them like a living nightmare. It lunged, its claws slicing through the air with terrifying speed. And then everything went still. The whisper stopped, the air went silent, and for a brief moment, time itself seemed to freeze. She felt the light inside her flare brighter than ever, and then there was nothing but a blinding flash of silver. When the silver light faded, she found herself standing in the middle of a scorched, barren field. The lot, the buildings, the shadows, everything was gone, replaced by a strange and desolate landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that felt alive, pressing against her skin like an unseen force. The man was still beside her, his expression grim but alert, his eyes scanning their surroundings with sharp precision. "What just happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "We were pulled through," he said, his tone clipped. "They must have used the energy you released to create a rift." "A rift to where?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "To their domain," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We're in their world now." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The creatures hadn't been defeated, they had retreated, luring her deeper into their territory. Her light may have driven them back, but it had also marked her as a threat, and now they were determined to eliminate her on their own terms. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting subtly with each step as if the earth itself were alive. In the distance, faint shapes moved across the horizon, their forms too far away to make out clearly but unmistakably ominous. She could feel their attention on her, a cold and unrelenting pressure that sent shivers down her spine. "They're regrouping," the man said, his voice low. "We need to move before they strike again." She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. As they started walking, she noticed that the silver light still clung faintly to her skin, like an aura that refused to fade. It was comforting, in a way, but also terrifying because if she could feel its power, so could they. The landscape seemed to shift as they moved, the terrain twisting and warping in ways that defied logic. What had appeared to be a straight path suddenly curved sharply to the left, and towering structures materialized out of thin air, their jagged forms casting long, menacing shadows. The whispers had returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing moment, threading through her mind like a needle pulling at loose fabric. "What do they want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. "It's not just you," the man said. "It's what you are. That light inside you, it's ancient, older than even they are. And it terrifies them." "Why me?" she pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. "Because you were born with it," he said simply. "You're the only one who can wield it. And they know that if you learn to control it, you'll be unstoppable." The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't wanted to be special or chosen or anything else that might paint a target on her back. But the truth was undeniable. Whatever this light was, it was a part of her, and there was no escaping it. Ahead of them, the ground suddenly split open, a massive chasm yawning wide across their path. From its depths came a sound that was neither a growl nor a scream but something in between, a noise so primal and raw that it seemed to reverberate in her very bones. "They're coming," the man said, his grip tightening on the metallic disc. And then the creatures emerged, their forms more grotesque and twisted than before. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their movements were sharper, more deliberate, as if they had shed whatever limitations had held them back before. The largest of them stepped forward, its clawed hand clutching a jagged staff that pulsed with dark energy. It raised the staff high, and the ground around them trembled violently. The man pushed her behind him, his expression hardening. "This is it," he said. No holding back this time. She didn't know if he was speaking to her or himself, but she felt the weight of his words nonetheless. The silver light inside her began to stir, responding to the growing threat with an intensity that made her entire body hum with energy. But just as she was bracing herself for the battle, the largest creature lowered its staff, and the ground went still. It spoke, its voice a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "She does not belong here," it said, its glowing eyes fixed on her. "And yet she carries the mark of the ancients." A contradiction. An abomination. "She's none of those things," the man said sharply, stepping forward. "She's a force you can't hope to control." The creature let out a low, rumbling laugh, the sound filled with a cruel kind of amusement. "You misunderstand," it said. "We do not seek to control her. We seek to destroy her before she becomes a threat." The man's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the creature raised its staff again, and a wave of dark energy shot toward them. He moved quickly, the blue light from his disc flaring brightly as it formed a barrier around them. The energy collided with the barrier, sending shockwaves rippling through the air, but it held firm. "Run!" he shouted, glancing back at her. "I'm not leaving you!" She yelled, the silver light around her flaring in response to her rising emotions. "You don't have a choice," he snapped. "If they capture you, it's over for both of us." Her instincts screamed at her to stay, to fight, but she knew he was right. She turned and ran, her heart pounding as the ground shifted beneath her feet. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the creatures were calling out to her, trying to pull her back. But then, something changed. The silver light around her pulsed more strongly, and for the first time, the whispers faltered. The creatures hesitated, their forms flickering as if they were unsure of themselves. She skidded to a stop, turning back to face them. The man was still holding the barrier, but it was clear he was struggling, the blue light dimming under the relentless assault. And then she understood. The light wasn't just a weapon, it was a shield, a force that could drive back the darkness if she let it. Taking a deep breath, she focused all her energy on the light inside her, willing it to grow stronger. It responded immediately, flaring so brightly that it illuminated the entire landscape, casting the creatures into stark relief. They recoiled, their forms distorting and shrinking under the intensity of the light. The largest creature let out a furious roar, its staff shattering as the energy it had summoned was consumed by the silver glow. But before she could feel any sense of triumph, the ground beneath her feet began to crack, deep fissures spreading outward in every direction. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange, electric energy that made her skin prickle. And then, from the largest fissure, something began to emerge. It was massive, its form cloaked in shadow, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the air with a sense of crushing inevitability. The man's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "We have to go. Now!" She hesitated, her gaze locked on the emerging figure, but he grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the fissure. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and grim. "Not even close." As they ran, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, carrying with them a single, chilling word chosen. The fissures deepened, and the air became so thick it felt like they were running through water. The enormous figure continued to rise, its shadow stretching across the warped landscape, consuming everything in its path. Every instinct told her to keep running, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the monstrous presence behind them. But the silver light within her pulsed with defiance, pushing against the fear that threatened to paralyze her. The man didn't let go of her arm as he guided her toward what looked like a jagged spire in the distance. He moved with purpose, his focus entirely on getting them there. "It's a gate," he said between breaths, his voice strained. "It might get us out of here, but you'll need to use the light to activate it." Her heart sank. She barely understood what the light was, let alone how to control it, but there was no time for hesitation. The figure behind them let out a sound that shook the ground, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. The smaller creatures were scattering now, their forms dissolving into shadow as they retreated from the immense force that had taken their place. It wasn't just her they feared anymore. When they reached the base of the spire, it became clear that it wasn't just a random formation. Strange markings ran along its surface, glowing faintly as if responding to their presence. The man released her arm and turned to face the looming figure, raising his disc once again. The blue light flickered weakly, and she could see the exhaustion etched into his face. "You focus on the gate," he said firmly. "I'll buy you time." She didn't argue, though every part of her wanted to tell him to stay with her. Turning to the spire, she pressed her hands against its cool surface, hoping that the light inside her would know what to do. For a moment, nothing happened. The markings remained faint, and the air around her grew heavier as the figure closed in. Desperation clawed at her chest, and she slammed her fists against the spire. "Come on!" she shouted. "Work, damn it!" The silver light surged, flooding her senses with warmth and energy. The markings
on the spire flared to life, casting a brilliant glow that seemed to push back the darkness. A low resonated from deep within the structure, and she could feel the gate beginning to respond. But the immense figure wasn't slowing. Its shadow loomed over them, and the ground shook with each of its steps. The man shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the approaching figure. She glanced back just in time to see his barrier shatter, the blue light scattering like shards of glass. He fell to one knee, the disc slipping from his hand as the figure raised an enormous arm, ready to strike. "No!" she screamed, the silver light within her erupting in response. Without thinking, she extended her hand, and a beam of brilliant light shot out, striking the figure square in the chest. It staggered, its form flickering as if struggling to hold itself together. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a guttural laugh, the sound filled with a chilling sense of triumph. "You think that will stop me?" it rumbled, its voice shaking the very air. "You have only delayed the inevitable." The gate behind her flared brighter, and she could feel its pull, a force that promised escape if she could only hold the figure off long enough. She turned back to the man, who was struggling to stand. "Get to the gate," she shouted. "I'll cover you," but he shook his head, his expression grim. "It won't work unless you go first. You're the key. The light only responds to you." Her stomach twisted. She didn't want to leave him, but the truth was clear. If she stayed, neither of them would survive. The figure was regaining its balance, its massive form advancing once again. She took a step toward the gate, the pull growing stronger, but hesitated. "You have to promise me," she said, her voice shaking. "Promise you'll follow." "I will," he said, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Now go." The pull of the gate became overwhelming, and she felt herself being drawn into its light. She glanced back one last time, her heart pounding as she watched the man raise the disc again, blue light sparking weakly as he faced the figure alone. Then the gate consumed her, and everything went white. She landed hard on a cold, metallic surface, the air knocked from her lungs. When she opened her eyes, she found herself back in the parking lot. The familiar buildings and streetlights surrounded her, but something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too absolute. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around for any sign of the man, or the figure. But the lot was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the streetlights, their glow casting long shadows across the asphalt. She took a step forward, her chest tightening as she realized the silver light was gone. She felt ordinary, powerless. A sudden sound behind her made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. But it wasn't the man. It was a child, a boy no older than 10, standing in the middle of the lot. His silver hair gleamed under the streetlights, and his eyes, unnervingly familiar, met hers with a calm intensity. "You made it back," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But it's not over." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" He smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in his expression. "You already know. The light wasn't just a gift. It was a message. And you're not the only one who received it." Before she could respond, the boy's form began to dissolve, his body breaking apart into shimmering particles of light. They floated upward, merging with the stars above, leaving her standing alone once more. The of the streetlights faded, and the lot was plunged into darkness. And then, from the shadows, a familiar voice spoke. "I told you it wasn't over." She turned sharply, her breath catching as the man stepped into the dim glow of a distant light. He looked battered, his clothes torn and his face smeared with dirt, but his eyes burned with determination. "Tears still coming," he said, his voice low. "And now, they know you're the only one who can stop them." Her pulse quickened, the weight of his words sinking in. She had thought the fight was over, that she could return to a normal life. But as the shadows around them began to stir, she realized the battle had only just begun. The shadows around them writhed as if alive, the oppressive feeling of being watched settling heavily over her. The man's words echoed in her mind, carrying a weight she wasn't ready to bear. She didn't want to be the answer, the one who could stop them. All she wanted was to go back to a time when her hair was just a curious trait, not the key to something far bigger than herself. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. The silver light inside her flickered weakly, as though reflecting her doubt. "How am I supposed to stop them?" "You don't have to do it alone," the man said, stepping closer. He reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Despite his exhaustion, his gaze was steady, filled with an unyielding resolve. "The light chose you for a reason. It's part of you. You just need to trust it." She closed her eyes, trying to find that trust within herself. Memories flashed through her mind, the boy's calm, knowing smile, the raw power she had felt when the light surged, and the strange connection she had sensed with the spire. The light wasn't just something given to her, it was something she had always carried, even if she hadn't understood it. The ground beneath them began to tremble, pulling her back to the present. The shadows coalesced into forms, figures with glowing eyes and jagged edges stepping forward. They moved with eerie precision, their movements unerringly coordinated. At their center, the enormous figure that had pursued them earlier emerged, its presence dominating everything around it. "You can't run anymore," the figure rumbled, its voice deep and resonant. "You've opened the gate, and now the balance must be restored." The man moved in front of her protectively, though his stance was unsteady. She could see he didn't have much left to give. A surge of emotion rose within her, fear, yes, but also anger. Anger that her life had been turned upside down, that people who had helped her were suffering because of her. And anger that this figure, this thing, dared to speak of balance when it was intent on destruction. "I'm not running," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. The silver light flared again, brighter this time, coursing through her veins and filling her with warmth and clarity. She stepped forward, the man looking at her with both surprise and relief. "If you want balance, then let's find it. But you don't get to decide what that looks like." The figure paused, as if taken aback by her defiance. Then it laughed, a sound that reverberated through the earth like an earthquake. "You think you can challenge me? You're nothing but a spark compared to the inferno I command." She didn't flinch. Instead, she focused on the light, letting it guide her. She raised her hand, and the light poured out, forming a barrier between them and the advancing shadows. The figures hissed and recoiled, but the larger one remained unfazed. It charged, the ground shaking with each step, but she held her ground. The clash was blinding. The silver light met the figure's darkness, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the air, and she could feel the strain in every fiber of her being. But she didn't let go. The light was part of her, and she poured everything she had into it. The figure faltered, its form flickering and breaking apart. It let out a roar of frustration, and she pushed harder, driving the light into its core. The shadows around them dissolved, the oppressive weight lifting as the silver light consumed the darkness. Finally, with one last defiant scream, the figure shattered into 1,000 fragments, which dissipated into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. She lowered her hand, the light dimming but not disappearing. The man stepped up beside her, his expression a mix of awe and relief. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately. Her legs felt like they might give out, but the light within her kept her steady. She turned to him, a question forming in her mind. "Is it over?" He hesitated, looking around at the now still and empty lot. "For now," he admitted. "But there will always be something. The light doesn't just choose randomly. It's meant to protect, to keep the balance. And as long as you carry it, you'll be part of that fight." The weight of his words settled over her, but this time, it didn't feel as crushing. She had faced something unimaginable and survived. She had learned to trust herself, to embrace the power that had always been within her. It wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The man gave her a small smile. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And you'll never be alone in this." She nodded, a quiet determination building within her. The silver light pulsed softly, a steady rhythm that felt like her own heartbeat. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she would face it head-on. As they walked away from the empty lot, the first hints of dawn began to break over the horizon. The soft light of the sun mingled with the lingering silver glow, painting the world in hues of hope and renewal. She glanced at the man beside her, and for the first time since this had all begun, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. She didn't have all the answers, but she had found something more important, herself. And as the light continued to shine within her, she knew she would keep moving forward, no matter what came next.